My name is Juliana Freiberg, and today we are interviewing Ryan Miller. And Ryan, can you tell us about what you do here and your job position?
So I'm the Director of Treaty Rights and Government Affairs for Tulalip, and I've been working for the tribe. Well, I started as a summer youth when I was 15 here at the hatchery where we are today, and so I'm 34 now, and yeah, it's been a long time. Been working for the tribe for more than half my life, and I've done all kinds of different jobs. I worked here at the hatchery and helped raise fish, and then I worked in the stock assessment lab for the fisheries department, so sampling adult commercial catch. Right now, my job is mostly focused on natural resources policy and political intergovernmental work. So I do work related to elections outside the tribe, and coordinate consultation between the tribe and state and federal agencies, things like that.
So Ryan, how is climate change affecting us?
Well, climate change affects all parts of things that the tribe and tribal members are interested in, from public utilities to health to natural resources, all the things that the tribe provides as services to its members, or things that the tribe is interested in protecting, are affected by climate change. So really, it's more of an overlay over all the things that we focus on as a tribe than it is an effect on a single thing. When it comes to natural resources, there's significant impacts from climate change. When it comes to public health, there's things like increased respiratory disease, asthma, heat stroke, things like that we expect to see. And so, as a tribe, we have to plan for all of those things for our members and how we're going to change our services, adapt the things that we do, and be prepared to protect our members in the future as climate change continues to get worse.
What is happening to our salmon, and how is climate change affecting our salmon?
Well, salmon is a complicated story. For the last 10,000 years before Euro-American contact, tribal people have had a reciprocal relationship with salmon that's, evolved over that period of time. Salmon have continued to come back and sustain our people for generations and generations, and in turn, our people have continued to make sure that all the habitats are there, that the water is clean, so that salmon can prosper. Since Euro-American contact, a lot has happened. There's been significant development that's degraded salmon habitat. There's been water quality issues that are related to cars and development and all kinds of other things. So many things have impacted salmon over that time that many of the species in the Pacific Northwest are listed as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And just like with all the other things that climate change impacts, it's an overlay over all of that, right? So one example, limits on habitat significantly limit the number of salmon that can be produced by any given stream. And climate change is going to make that worse, because as our streams change from being influenced by both melting glacier water and rainwater to being more significantly influenced just by rainwater, that's going to increase the severity and the frequency of floods. So floods are going to happen more often, and they're going to be worse. And that's going to scour redds. So when the salmon go up and they dig their redds, they lay their eggs. When floods happen, the pressure from the water as it's traveling down washes the eggs out of the redds, and it kills them. So that's one of the ways in which we expect to see climate change have impacts on salmon. There are lots of other ones. Changing ocean conditions and ocean chemistry change the food availability in the nearshore and offshore marine environment. So right now we've been doing a study for the last 7 or 8 years called the Marine Survival Study, where we look at zooplankton and phytoplankton numbers at specific locations throughout the Puget Sound. And then we look at the populations of salmon and the health of them in those areas. And the reason why we're doing that is because zooplankton are sort of, particularly certain types of zooplankton, are the number one food source for salmon in the nearshore and offshore marine environments. So the small salmon, after they come out of the stream or they're released from the hatchery where we are today, they go out and they eat these little zooplankton. Sometimes they're bugs, sometimes they're crab larvae, things like that. And what we found is that as climate change has happened and ocean temperatures have changed and are warming earlier in the season, a lot of the salmon, as they're traveling down, are not arriving in the marine waters at the same time when those blooms of zooplankton are available to them. And because of that, many of the salmon aren't reaching the size that they need to reach by their first winter in order to survive. So only half the fish are really reaching the size that's necessary for them to survive their first winter. And that's really been triggered by this change in climate and the change in temperature and ocean conditions that's happened over the last 20 years. And it's going to get significantly worse over time. So when it comes to climate change, pretty much all of the things that can impact salmon in all the different stages of their life, whether it's as juvenile outmigrants, as smolts in the river and then in the marine environment, and then as adults coming back. When we have significant high temperatures and drought events like we had in 2015 and like we had again this year, when adult salmon are swimming back upstream, oftentimes the temperature of the stream that they're in goes above what we consider to be lethal levels. So the water is so hot that salmon can't survive. And what we see is a lot of what we call pre-spawn mortality. So fish are dying before they lay their eggs, or for males before they're able to spawn with females and produce offspring. So there are all kinds of different ways in which climate change affects salmon. And they're, in some cases, they're very difficult to try to figure out what we can do about them, especially when it comes to the marine environment, because it's so difficult to change, right? All the world's oceans are connected. The Pacific Ocean is the largest ocean in the world, and our salmon don't stay here. They go all the way up to Alaska, and they come all the way back. And that's a long way to go to get impacted by all these, the lack of food availability and all these other things that are exacerbated by climate change.
What has climate change done to our community, and how is it affecting us?
So, climate change is super important to tribal communities, and it has a serious effect on tribal communities because unlike most other non-Indian communities, we live off the land, and we live a culture and a life way that has existed since time immemorial. Things have changed, right? We live in a modern world, but we live in a way where we're closer to the land than anybody else. And that means that we're going to feel those effects more than almost any other community. For a number of different reasons, right? One, part of it is because we're the salmon people. We depend on salmon, and as salmon disappear, it makes it more and more difficult for us to continue our culture. The culture and the natural resources are so intimately tied together that you really can't have one without the other. So as those disappear, we're not just talking about losing these iconic species that are super important to the ecosystem, that are indicators of damage that's being done to all the other species around them, but we're literally losing a culture that's existed since time immemorial because it's so connected to those natural resources. So, for all of those reasons, it's incredibly important for tribal people to be able to adapt to and mitigate for climate change as much as possible. And that includes putting pressure on outside agencies, state agencies, state governments, the federal government to do their job in upholding and protecting tribal treaty rights and tribal sovereignty in the face of climate change. So it's not just what we can do, it's about putting pressure on these other organizations and governments to do everything that they can to fulfill their obligation to tribes, to protect these resources that were guaranteed to tribes in the treaty.
Can you highlight what is being done to combat this issue?
Well, I think a lot of different things, right? One of the big things that we can do, we know that climate change is going to continue to get worse. So one of the best ways we can deal with that is we can plan for it. So in 2015, 2016, Tulalip Natural Resources went after a few different grants from the Bureau of Indian Affairs around climate resiliency. And what we were going to do was take that money and put together a team within the tribe, as well as a consultant that we hired on the outside to do what's called a climate adaptation plan. And in a climate adaptation plan, the goal is to look at all the things that are of interest to the tribe and figure out how is climate change going to affect those things, and then plan for how the tribe can adapt to those changes in order to continue to provide all the services to our members that we want to, and to continue to protect the natural resources and all the other things that we're interested in. And it's been a long process. Like I said, we started in 2000, got the initial grant in 2015. We've gotten subsequent grants every year after that to continue that process. And, we have produced a climate adaptation plan. And we've taken basically what we learned in that plan and looked at specific sectors that we thought needed more focus. So right now we're working on a climate and health plan that's focused particularly on how climate change is going to impact the health of our people. And that when we talk about health, we're not just talking about physical health, we're talking about spiritual health and mental health, all those things together. So we're talking about how when climate change impacts first foods and those aren't available for us, how that impacts us spiritually. How the dread of what climate change might do to the environment or to our futures impacts our mental health. All those things. So, that's sort of the process that we're going through right now, is trying to develop as many plans as we can to deal with how climate change is going to continue to affect all the things that the tribe is interested in. So we've got some stuff going on right now. We just received notice that we got 3 more climate change grants this year to work on a couple of different things. One of them is called Coastal Retreat. So as climate change happens and sea levels continue to rise, that's gonna erode our banks, and that means that we've got to move houses away from the banks. And so in order to do that, we've got a plan. We've got to figure out how we're going to do that. What are we going to do? If they're tribal members' houses, where are we going to put them? If they're non-tribals' houses, how are we going to convince them that they need to move these places away? Because another thing that damages salmon habitat and makes it difficult for salmon to continue to live is when we armor our shores. We put concrete up, or we put riprap up to protect the shore to keep it from eroding away. The problem is that those shorelines are important habitats for salmon, particularly juveniles, who use those, the overhangs and the branches that are hanging down to hide from predators, to stay in the shade out of the sun that can damage them. So those are all kind of big parts of this planning effort to figure out, how can we deal with climate change in a way where we can continue to live the lifeways that our people have for, since time immemorial. And, we're doing all of those planning efforts, and then we're also doing a bunch of research. So research around how is climate change going to affect water availability in the forest, and what can we do to manage forests in a different way that might retain more water on the landscape, make it better for salmon, make it better for trees, for the berries, for all of the animals that are important to us. And then, as I talked about before, the study on the marine survival. So trying to figure out what are these particular parts of the food system that are being altered by climate change, and then is there anything we can do to help mitigate those circumstances? So what can we do to bring back the foods for the salmon at the right times in the right locations so that they can be successful, so that they can go, make their trip all the way to Alaska and back to us so that they can be caught, so that they can reproduce in the natural spawning areas. So all kinds of different things. A big part of it is planning, but the other part of it is research. as a whole, not just the tribe, but as a world, right? We don't know everything we need to know in order to combat climate change. We have to find out more information about how climate change is going to affect all the things that we care about. So there's a lot of planning and there's a lot of research being done to try to deal with all that.
What has the state government done to help with climate change?
So in the 2020 Washington State legislative session, tribes worked really hard with the governor's office and legislators in both the House and the Senate to pass Senate Bill 5126. It's commonly referred to as the Climate Commitment Act. And essentially what that bill does is sets up what we call a cap and invest system. So we set a cap on the total emissions in the state, and that cap reduces over time. Every year after the enaction of the act, the cap on emissions reduces. And it charges polluters, people who, companies that produce greenhouse gas emissions, it charges them for every ton of CO2 that is released from their facilities. And then it uses that money to invest in two different things. One, in what we call like healthy landscapes, resilient landscapes. So things that can absorb carbon naturally, like forests and water, and projects that mitigate for climate change impacts, like habitat improvements and habitat protection. All those things that we talked about earlier that are really important for salmon. And all the other species that we care about as well. And then the other thing it does is it invests money in technologies that reduce emissions. So the goal here is, as the cap on the emissions in the state is continuing to go down every year, we need to produce new technologies and find new ways to do the same things that we do, make all the same products, have the same energy output, all those things that we need to do in a cleaner way that produces less emissions. And so it spends the rest of that money trying to figure out how do we reduce emissions for the state overall. And sometimes that's, for Washington State, the number one contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is transportation. Transportation makes up 40% of this state's greenhouse gas emissions every year. That means the cars we drive, the buses, all of that stuff, the trucks that deliver our goods, all of those things. So one of the big things that we can do is figure out how to expand our public transportation, make our trucking greener so that they produce less emissions. How can we get more cars off of the road? We need to be able to do all those things in order to reduce our emissions. Now, in the grand scheme of things, the state only contributes about 0.1% of the total global emissions. So it's a small part of it. But what we're trying to do, and we've taken a big step in doing that, is we're trying to set a model for the rest of the world to say, like, you can do this. Everybody can do this. We come together, we work hard to make this legislation, we pass it, and then we charge the people who are producing the emissions. So we make the emitters, the polluters, pay. And then we take that money and we invest it in building resilient landscapes and reducing emissions over time. And the goal of that is to get to net zero emissions in the state of Washington by the year 2050. And so that's what we're all working towards right now. That legislation just passed. We're in the rulemaking period. Tribes are working with the state agencies, particularly the Department of Ecology, who's going to be administering the programs under the act, to try to figure out how we can set this act up to be successful. And there are lots of different components of it that are important for tribes. There's this overall part of it that's like reducing emissions and building healthy landscapes, but also tribes lobbied really hard to get set-asides for tribal projects. So 10% of all the money that's generated from these charges to polluters has to go towards projects that are sponsored by tribes. And that's really important because, as we talked about before, right, tribal communities are probably the most impacted by climate change of any community in the state because of our relationship with natural resources. So those are the kinds of things that the state has done. They passed another piece of legislation last session called the Clean Fuel Standards, which is about what I was talking about before with transportation, right? In order to reduce our emissions, we need to have cleaner fuels to burn in our vehicles. We need to have cleaner fuels that burn in all of our transportation sectors. And so there's the Clean Fuel Standard sets up a mechanism for doing that. And, I think those are the kinds of pieces of legislation that can shift the local and the national and the global attitude on how to deal with climate change.
So thank you for coming here today and having this conversation with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to talk to you guys, and I'm really happy to see you guys are taking an interest in this work because it's really important, and it's going to be something that you're going to be dealing with for the rest of your lives. So pretty soon, old people like me are going to pass the torch to you guys. Thank you.